Intercom is a strange and unique company. We're a large, late-stage software firm that's also bet everything on AI. You typically only find early-stage startups that are as all-in on AI in the way that we are. This means that we have a depth of expertise with building excellent software. We've done that for over a decade. We're known for it. But we're learning that while that served us well in the past, we're going to need to rethink our approach for this AI future. In this episode of Off Script, Emmet Connolly, our longtime head of design at Intercom and a core contributor to every strategic decision we make here, looks back on where we've come from and forward to where we're going. He explains how the advent of modern AI has us revisiting everything, from how we design and build interfaces, all the way to fundamentally rethinking our products, and the role of software designers here too. This is us very much sharing what we're learning at scale as we pivot in the hopes that it'll be valuable to you as you start to do the same. I hope you enjoy.
Those that do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. If you look at the past, you can often pattern match from previous waves of technology, or you can maybe plot the course of change and extrapolate and try and predict what the future is going to hold. Marshall McLuhan called this looking at the present through a rearview mirror. Looking through a rearview mirror is a somewhat limiting frame of reference, and so you can't always take those frameworks from the past and just apply them to what's going to happen next. The rest of the McLuhan quote actually is, and in doing so, we walk backwards into the future. And I think that's a good way of thinking about how products might change as a result of AI. There's a lot we can learn from looking back, but there's also this sense that a lot might be different this time around. Every new wave of technology has led to new user interfaces, and the technology is often an unlock to some new user interface innovation. If you look back at way back, right, into the 19th century, and you think about where the telegraph came from, there were solutions for long distance communication at the time, and a lot of them were not that great. They were things like sending mail by train or Pony Express or whatever, and they had limitations. When electricity and an understanding of magnetism came along, that was the unlock that allowed the telegraph to be invented and solve the problems of a lot of the previous user interfaces for communicating over long distances. But some of the inherent limitations in this new thing become readily apparent very quickly as well. You require miles and miles of cabling, so it can only be done between a very specific point A and point B. You require experts at each end to encode and decode. Almost as soon as a new technology unlocks a new interface, the limitations of that interface become apparent, and we're waiting for the next unlock to happen. The limitations of the telegraph are what led to, let's say, in some sense, radio. Limitations of radio led to television, and we've seen this in the computer age as well, from mainframe computers leading to, let's say, personal computers with command line interfaces, which led to graphical user interfaces, which led to multi-touch interfaces. You notice with each of those new hops that you make, the user interface becomes less abstracted away, less the language of computers and more the language of humans. And I think the thing that has really blown people's minds, in a sense, with AI arriving on the scene is it is by far the most, almost to an uncanny sense, human-like form of technology that we have encountered so far. And that's because of the human-like language aspect of it. In the very earliest stages of a new technology, we tend to grasp onto familiar metaphors as a way of engaging with the new technology initially. Keyboard is a keyboard because of typewriters. Desktop operating system, the earliest versions looked like the surface of a desk. That's why it's called a desktop. Early iPhone apps had this skeuomorphic look, which was a very tactile look and feel to help people understand that they could touch and interact with these things in a sense of direct manipulation. There is always an evolution from that point where we will figure out, what is the more sophisticated, expressive, native to the new technology form that this can take. You see this in all sorts of media, that you can point to through time. If you look at early cinema, for example, right? The very first silent movies were take a camera, point it at a theatre stage and record a play. It was a thing that people were very familiar with. And the early versions that started to move beyond that, in some sense, start to feel unfamiliar to people at first. There's the famous example of Lumiere brothers' train pulling into a station, coming fast towards the camera, and the audience like running terrified from the theatre because they thought it was going to come out. But they get the hang of it soon. The new language co-develops, in a sense, between the makers and the audience. And so you had filmmakers like Eisenstein experimenting with editing and developing with the audience a shared language of cinema. So now today, you can look at an establishing shot or a close-up or a reaction shot, and you understand from a storytelling point of view what those things mean. You can even go further and start to subvert it and do non-linear storytelling, and the audience will come with you on that journey. So when we think of AI user interface today, we mostly think of chat apps, like ChatGPT. And that is because the very familiar user interface of messaging is a handy metaphor to apply onto AI and a great starting point, but almost certainly won't be the ending point. We will continue to evolve from here. We have often been able to look at the past and do that pattern matching thing. One example of that, for example, is Moore's Law. Well, Moore's Law says the number of transistors on an integrated circuit doubles every couple of years, which is a nerdy way of saying, in a very linear, steady way, computers get faster every couple of years. That has meant that we have been able to extrapolate and figure out with a fair degree of certainty, like how fast are computers going to be a couple of years from now, and to plan accordingly. The same doesn't hold for AI at all. We have had so much new capability technologically available to us very suddenly that there's a lot more juice we can squeeze out of that in terms of inventing products and new ways of doing things, even with today's capabilities. There's probably also an adoption overhang. The emergence of the model capabilities is a lot more like put a bunch of information into the thing and see what comes out of it. It's a lot more like discovery than invention. And even the makers of the models can't really predict what next year's iteration of the models are going to look like. The pace of change is very, very fast. That degree of uncertainty is making a lot of people nervous. It is easier to predict what will go away than it is to predict the precise solution that's going to replace it. We have been building customer service software for over a decade, and a lot of what you do is you chip away year after year to try to improve existing workflows that are there. But there are a lot of things that almost seem like immovable objects. So in customer service, that might be like you're going to have a certain amount of massive inbound volume of questions from your customers to deal with. Your product might have a certain degree of real deep complexity that you have to know a lot about in order to answer all the full range of questions that might come into you. And AI is a thing that has the potential to change that. For example, the amount of inbound volume now doesn't necessarily need to be a thing that you can't get away from, because a certain amount of that can be dealt with via AI. It's almost a meme or a joke or whatever about customer service that you're going to spend an hour listening to a tinny 20-second loop of green sleeves on your phone while you're waiting for someone to pick up on the other end. Very soon, green sleeves on your phone is going to sound as outdated and anachronistic as a dial-up modem sounds to us today. I saw this little website recently, and you can put in your Twitter username and it tells you what your first tweet was. My first tweet was in November 2006 for my sins. That's a long time ago. And it was something like, I'm sitting here on hold. For a list of ways in which technology has failed to improve your life, press 3 now. Some things feel like they never change in technology if you take the long view back. But then maybe if you wait around long enough, you'll eventually have the chance to actually make a change. Anyone who uses software or products today will probably have this feeling that man, this thing is really complex. Why is it so complicated? And the answer is not, in most cases, because the designer was really bad at their job. It was because the nature of the products that we use is that they often have to serve a very diverse user base. If you think about how our cities are designed, do you optimize for like the cyclist or the driver? And the answer is, well, both of them are legitimate users of your city and you have to try and serve both of them. But what you often end up with is a, if you'll pardon the pun, middle of the road solution. You know, how can AI solve this complexity problem? Generative AI is really good at generating stuff. The early versions that we saw was text, and then we saw lots of images being generated. And more recently, we're seeing audio.
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking.
And video being generated with pretty plausible looking results. So it is therefore not a massive leap of the imagination to imagine user interfaces being generated on the fly. Instead of these general purpose but somewhat compromised tools that get bogged down in complexity, you can have a nice, clean, simple little UI that is custom generated in the moment for the precise use case, for the precise user that it's needed for in that moment. Imagine you're contacting a company and you let them know that you want to like change your billing information. Now, if we just use, you know, a chat UI for doing that entirely through AI, it's still pretty laborious to say like, I want to change my billing information. And then you get a text reply in a chat bubble and it says, cool, what's your new address? And you type your address and then it says, oh, you left out your postcode, what's that? And you type that and then it says, is your billing address the same as your postal address? And it is not a very frictionless user interface. Instead of that, you can imagine a generative UI version of that where you say, I want to update my billing information. And you might just get a simple little widget that has a couple of form fields to fill out and a checkbox. And the advantage of that is it has a lot of properties of good user interfaces. It tells you what you can do instead of maybe being faced with a blank text box and you wondering, what can I even put in here? I actually used to work at Google and I learned something quite interesting about friction in user interfaces. I was working on the search results page and we artificially slowed down how long it took for the search results page to load, but only by like a minute amount, like something like 40 milliseconds. Nobody complained, nobody wrote in, but their behavior actually changed. For the people who had the artificially slower results, even though they were below conscious human perception, that cohort of people searched less frequently on a daily basis. And so something deep in the crevices of their brain made this kind of trade-off and said, nah, it's not quite worth it to perform that search because of the friction involved. Choosing the right modality and the one that provides the least friction for getting your answer or performing your task should always be something that designers are thinking about. These big disruptive waves of technology don't simply leave existing workflows as they are and reduce friction. They will often tend to turn over the whole apple cart and upset things in a much more obvious way. We've seen a lot of AI emoji sparkles features, which is like, you have a button and you add a little AI sparkle emoji to it and it does that thing automatically instead of doing it manually. But that really is, in many cases, only the starting point for thinking about how AI will impact the design of your product. You've got to have a sense of where you're going, whether this is going to be a small set of optimizations or a complete rethink of your product category. Self-driving cars is actually a good analogy here. The industry actually defined levels of self-drivingness, or level 0 to level 5, where level 0 is, no automation. Level 1 is small amounts of automation like cruise control, all the way up to level 5, which is full self-driving. If you go to San Francisco today, you see empty cars driving themselves around the streets. And again, if you go through enough of those levels, you will eventually get to where you're trying to figure out where you're going. We've done something similar like this and tried to develop a kind of a maturity framework for AI adoption in customer service, going all the way from what you might think of as level 0, like no automation. It's all just humans sitting there typing responses to customers all day, all the way through little helpers, all the way up to what you might think of as level 5, which we are certainly not at yet. AI agents resolving 100% of customer queries. But at least you have kind of a framework, both for us as people that develop products, but also for our customers as the people who want to have a sense of, well, where is this going and is this a path that I want to be on? It is almost certain that Figma, which is a very common tool that designers use to create their UIs today, will develop the capability and a box that you can type into, and you can say, you know, make me a UI for iPhone app for a dog walking service, and hey, presto magico, you get it and it's rendered there. What's your reaction to that development? Is it, oh shit, that's my job and I'm about to be put out of a job? Or is it, oh, that's actually pretty interesting and exciting because that is like the least important aspect of my job today? I think that the drawing rectangles aspect of the role, frankly, is the most junior designer aspect of the role and the one that is very time consuming. And most designers want to spend most of their time on other things like problem solving, coming up with ideas, being creative. And these are the things that maybe offloading some of the more manual work aspects of the role to AI to handle will hopefully free us up to spend more time on those more creativity-oriented things. If you look at design today, there is a very broad element of sameness to a lot of stuff. All the websites look the same. All of the smartphones look the same. All of the cars look the same. The Airbnbs you stay in look the same. The hipster coffee shops look the same. The movie posters look the same. There's a lot of sameness, and this has been referred to as like the age of average. All design exists on a spectrum from cheap and fast to expensive and high quality, right? And if AI can commodify the cheap and fast end of that spectrum, it raises the floor for what we would expect like the worst design to be. It also raises the ceiling for what designers can do with their craft and the level of taste and creativity that they can apply there. Once the creation of that samey design artifacts does become commodified, it creates an opportunity for the bespoke, artisanal, thoughtful, opinionated, taste-oriented, more expensive, whatever. Culture is always the back and forth conversation between what is normal and mainstream and the response to that. Human-centered design will still have a role in pushing culture forward and pushing the state of the art forward and pushing taste forward. If you were a drummer in the early 80s and the 808 came out, you might have thought like, oh, that's it, we're hosed. And in fact, what it results in is democratization of who can create music. And so you don't have to become a master at your craft in order to take part. But drummers still exist. And so there will still be necessity for people who will master the craft because it is an invaluable learning tool. There is definitely an element of mastery required. There's an element of learning craft required to get to mastery. And I think that will continue to be true, even if things like AI provide shortcuts to good enough. The human touch becomes more valued. We recently redesigned our website, the Intercom website. We wanted to create this sense of technology and the more humanistic element coexisting, right? So we use these very big, beautiful, expressive paintings of scenes to frame our product. And on Twitter, someone was like, what was the prompt that you used to create the paintings? And I replied like, oh, no prompt. We commissioned artists to create that we loved and respected their work, and we really wanted to get the chance to work with them. People were like completely surprised, and somehow that actually elevated people's appreciation, I think, of the work that we had done further because the human aspect was present in it. And I think that will probably be a trend of how we start to look at design and products going forward. New technologies often tend to be additive, more like an additional tool in the tool belt than some new thing that comes along and wipes away everything that came before it, you know. New technologies tend to have a very long half-life. They stick around for reasons of, well, there's a lot more things I can do here. Do I want to use a drummer or a drum machine? Do I want to use a generated image or a real image? Designers have been trying to make this type of change also happen for quite a while. There's a thing in design called design systems, where everyone wants to have like a reusable set of components that they can kind of drag and drop into their designs, that you can assemble a design from. Imagine having like the world's greatest, most up-to-date, most flexible and expressive design system at your fingertips. All that said, I would acknowledge that like change is hard, but focusing on the innate human-centered skills and thinking about design as an act of creativity and invention and not just an act of artifact creation or production is a healthy way to think about navigating the change that's coming. There is a way of thinking about design that you know, lots of people learn about in design school, and it's called the double diamond. The double diamond, like it's literally like a diamond, two diamonds like this, right? And the first stage, you explore a whole bunch of ideas divergently, and then you converge on a solution, one way you're going to solve it. And then you explore a bunch of different ways of designing and instantiating that solution, and you converge on one, and you've got your product at the end. That is the theory, right? The reality, as many people learn when they start designing products for real, is expressed in a different framework for doing design, which is called the squiggle. And the squiggle is insane, chaotic, mistakes, disagreements, backtracking, changing your mind back again. And eventually out of that, you find your way to the solution that you're happy with. Working with AI and the unpredictability of it, the fast-changing nature of it, the non-deterministic nature of it, is going to feel a lot more like that latter way of working. And so the final bit of advice I would give, I guess, to people is to embrace the squiggle. I mean, there are many ways in which some of the first or second order effects of all of this will be, you know, not good for designers or not good for society. And in many ways, it's our job to try and steer it in the right direction to ensure that those things don't actually happen. I often think of design as this perfect balance between like cranky dissatisfaction and almost revolutionary optimism. And both of those things coexisting in harmony. You have to be cranky in order to be a designer. You go around the place and you see that terribly kerned signage and, you know, that user interface that is not intuitive enough, and want to be pissed off enough to want to go and fix it. It is actually a real optimistic way of looking at the world, to be like, I could make that better, and I'm actually going to go and do that. So for me, at least, design is fundamentally, you know, an act of optimism, this belief that things can be made better. It's good to look backwards and see what we can learn from the past. It is fine to look forwards with a somewhat skeptical view for how it could all play out. But it's probably most important to keep pushing forward with that sense of optimism that we can actually make things better.